Well everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the Samsung Galaxy A10 and see how this specific device holds up in 2023. Now I don't really think anybody should be buying this type of phone anymore. I think it's fairly outdated for the most part, but it was a fairly good device when Samsung made it back in 2019, and I think it was a very good thing Samsung did here, because the Samsung Galaxy A series of devices are some of the most important devices that Samsung makes. They make probably a lot of money from them, but they're fairly cheap to make, they're fairly cheap to market and produce, and they're able to sell a massive quantity of them for sure. So if you want to pick up some phones, I would recommend buying this year. Links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now starting off with the outside of the Galaxy A10, on the front, you do have a 6.2-inch IPS LCD panel. It's a 720p display, and it was a pretty good display at that time. It wasn't perfect, it was not an OLED display, and it was only 720p. But to give you some perspective, if you think about it, the iPhone 11 and the iPhone 10R that were pretty much made around this time, those also had like a 750p display, and those were also IPS LCD panels. So it's not like this thing was super outdated. It definitely was not as good of a panel as those iPhones. But when you consider that this thing was selling for much less than those iPhones were, it kind of makes this thing a little bit of a sweeter deal, if you know what I'm talking about. So I would say from a price per dollar standpoint, that in and of itself was pretty surprising. But another thing with this phone is actually with the lack of bezel. There was very little bezel surrounding this type of device, which again was very surprising. When you were getting a phone like the Galaxy A10, you weren't paying that much money, but you were getting a phone that actually still looked pretty decent, which was honestly very surprising. So that kind of stuff is very cool to look at, and I was very happy when Samsung made this type of phone and decided to go down that direction, because that in and of itself made this phone a little bit more future-proofed. And even now in 2023, this phone still doesn't even look that old, which is pretty cool. So in terms of the front, that kind of covers it up there. Now this thing has a micro USB port, which is very outdated, has a headphone jack, and it also has a micro SD card slot, which is pretty cool. So you can just quickly go ahead and expand the storage if you wanted to. So that was pretty awesome. On top of that, you did also have a single camera setup on the back. So nothing super crazy here. I think everyone kind of expects this thing not to have that great of a camera. You had the flash. You did not have, a few things which we'll get into in a second. Speaker on the bottom left. And that was kind of it. Now this phone was missing a few crucial things. For one, there wasn't really any, wireless charging on this type of device, which may not be that big of a deal for some people, but I know some people may actually prefer having, wireless charging of some sort, but this device did not have it, which was kind of sad. On top of that, it also didn't have any IP certification. So that was something that, if you dip this phone in water by accident, this thing would not be able to basically survive it for the most part, depending on the dip. If it was like a massive 10-minute drop in the water, yeah, it's probably not going to survive it. But if it was a quick little thing, you should probably be okay for the most part, and that's probably another thing to kind of keep in mind there. So I would say on the outside, it still looks pretty good. There's not a lot of things to complain about there, but I look at something like the Galaxy A10 on the outside, and I was very happy with the way Samsung kind of made this phone. I think it definitely looked better than it probably should have, and that in and of itself is a very cool thing. So in terms of the outside, that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of the camera setup, like I mentioned, definitely not the craziest camera setup ever. It was a very budget phone, so keep that in mind. It had a 13 megapixel wide angle camera on the back, and it had a 5 megapixel camera on the front. Now with this type of camera, like I said, you're getting a very average camera for that moment. Now this thing did have a decent version of software on it for the most part, which that in and of itself was very surprising. So you could easily just go ahead and just still take pretty okay photos and videos for a 2019 budget phone. But as you probably suspect, this definitely was not that great of a camera during, at least today in this day and age. It's a pretty outdated camera. You're getting very limited features on it. I think that's probably the best way to put it. It's not a great camera, and it's pretty much not going to be lasting that long as you'd expect. If you wanted to take quick photos or videos, you'd probably be okay. But if you're trying to take very good quality photos or videos in this day and age, clearly that's not going to be able to happen here, and that might be one of the bigger issues you're going to be running, at least with this specific phone. So you're getting 1080p on the back. I don't even know if you can film video. You can film video on the front, but I don't know what the resolution of that would be. So those are the things where I look at this phone and I'm just very surprised at. So at least on the camera standpoint, that kind of covers it up there as well. Now another thing going on with this specific phone is actually with its software and longevity. So this phone has pretty much been outdated with software for quite a bit of time. It started off with Android 9. It did go up to Android 11, which was honestly pretty surprising. It has since been kind of discontinued with software, so it dropped support for the most part. And I definitely do think that's okay. When you get a phone like this, you're not expecting this phone to be like lasting as long as it could possibly be. So with a phone like this, you're definitely going to be getting not only an outdated phone, but it's not going to pretty much get any more software updates. It may get a security update here and there, but it kind of is outdated for the most part. So again, it's another one of those situations. It's not really worth getting a phone like this because it's been outdated with software for at least like 2 years, and Android 14 is coming out probably later this year, and then this thing's going to be like 3 years old at that point. So in terms of the software side, that pretty much covers it up there. Now on the performance side, this phone has that Exynos 7884 chipset inside with a Mali GPU, with 2 GB of RAM on the base model and 4 GB of RAM on the top tier model. Now 2 GB of RAM on a 2019 Android phone is actually quite a little bit of a problem, I would say. But for those of you who are planning on buying this phone, at least start like back in 2019, you probably weren't expecting this phone to be crazy good in performance. You're expecting it to probably be a little bit above average. And that's kind of what you were getting here. A little bit of above average, super budget phone that can pretty much make calls and text messages and maybe play a game here and there. But it would be a fairly choppy experience, and it'd probably be a slow experience for a lot of people. And that's kind of exactly what you're getting with this type of device. So for all intents and purposes, you are getting a very, very, average phone for the most part. And I think that's exactly what's going on here. So from my perspective, if you're planning on getting this phone for any type of heavy intensive performance, you would not be getting that good of an experience. In fact, you'd probably be getting a really, really bad experience because of the amount of not bloatware, but just the poor performance of these chipsets. If I'm being honest, that's kind of the biggest deal. You don't want to get a phone that's already super outdated, and that's exactly what's going on here. So from that perspective, that kind of covers it up there as well. This phone surprisingly honestly had a pretty decent sized battery though inside. It had a 3400 mAh battery, and for a phone like this, that's a pretty decent battery. It's definitely not the biggest battery of all time, but again, for being able to buy this phone for very, very cheap, it's actually not bad. And I do think that's one of the better aspects of this type of device too. So to kind of sum up this video, what I'll tell you is, although I wouldn't really say the Samsung Galaxy A10 is a great phone anymore, I do think it was a pretty solid phone when it first came out, and it really hit a price tag. It scratched that price tag itch that a lot of people probably had, and you could have easily bought this phone for not that expensive, and it could have easily handled everything you threw at it for that price tag. If you were trying to play super intensive games during that moment, this thing obviously would not have done that great of a job back then, and it definitely does not do that good of a job now. But if you're in the market and you want to buy a super cheap phone, there is no reason why you should be looking at this phone, and there's no reason you should be looking at any phone that is currently unsupported with software. The best thing to do if you're looking for a budget phone is to buy an older flagship or even an older mid-tier phone. So for example, a Samsung Galaxy S20 FE or Galaxy S21 FE would be considered kind of mid-tier phones. I would recommend buying those phones now. Those things are, a few years old, and those things are cheap. Maybe not the S21 FE, but the S20 FE is a few years old, and that phone is fairly cheaper now than it was before. The Galaxy S20, S21, and even a Galaxy S22 would be fairly cheap. The Pixel 6a, tremendous value. Pixel 5a still pretty good. The Pixel 7 and 6, those are pretty good used phones as well. But there really isn't a point of buying a Galaxy A10 anymore. So that pretty much covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.